Welcome and a very good afternoon to our distinguished guests. And thank you for taking the time to join us for our session on the future of livability, redefining urban indices. Today, we have convened a panel of experts to discuss how urban livability is changing now and going forward. We are privileged to have with us Lord Mayor Sally Capp from Melbourne to deliver the keynote address, and we also thank Ms. Ritu Bandari from EIU for being our moderator for today. Just yesterday, the Centre for Livable Cities launched our refreshed Singapore Livability Framework, which we hope will serve as a useful reference for city leaders, policymakers, and planners. Building upon our study of Singapore's urban journey, as well as emerging challenges, we have distilled what we believe are the key outcomes and supporting systems for livable and sustainable cities. I invite everyone to scan the QR code on the screen here to read our new e-publication titled Building Livable and Sustainable Cities, a Framework for the Future. In the book, we talk about harnessing the science of cities to help us understand our urban environments, to better inform policies and decision-making. Cities are complex systems, as this necessitates a data-driven approach towards their planning, development, and management. For instance, the City of Melbourne is ranked highly as a livable city, and its indicators for performance in various key areas act as signposts for the city to make policies, to make sure that policies are on track. Here in Singapore, one example of how we use data is by analyzing real-time public transport information, including crowd levels, to forecast peak travel periods and determine strategies to address congestion issues. Several index houses have also developed their own indices and methodologies to measure various aspects of urban life. These allow stakeholders and governments to look at how their city's performance change over time, pinpoint areas of improvement, and benchmark themselves amongst peers. This session brings together leading index houses to discuss the role of data and indices in shaping more livable urban futures, and in particular, consider the qualitative or softer components of livability. As global trends like climate change and demographic shifts come into play, there is also a need for new indicators that accurately reflect the evolving aspirations and concerns for our city dwellers. I am excited to learn from the upcoming discussions and take the insights back for our research at the CRC. Thank you and have a fruitful session ahead.
Right, thank you, Limin, for kicking off this session. And without further ado, may I now invite Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Sally Capp, to deliver the keynote address. Lord Mayor, please.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so pleased you took that photo down because I match it exactly today. I promise I don't wear it every day. Look, it's really wonderful to join you for this important forum and to be surrounded by city lovers and also people who value indices, so incredibly valuable, and really the way that we use them is absolutely key. Now, at the City of Melbourne, in the last 40 years particularly, we have focused our efforts around investments and programs that have at their heart livability. We've gone from being described as a moribund city in a rust bucket state to being regarded as one of the most livable cities in the world. And we're obsessed by benchmarks and indices, actually. And it's a great opportunity today just to also reflect and remind of those that are valuable for you and your cities and those that may not be so relevant or important. From our perspective, the focus on livability has certainly paid off. And thank you for the warm welcome about Melbourne's good ranking in so many indices. Ritu, we love the Economist intelligence units rankings every year. Our public are obsessed by when the rankings come out and where we place as well. And for the last 13 years, we have been in the top 10 of the Economist intelligence units, world's most livable cities, and it's become a real cornerstone benchmark for us. We also are consistently ranked for other elements that we see as cornerstones of livability in our city. For example, student experience, where we've set an ambition to be the #1 student experience in the world. We're currently ranked #4 and #1 in Australia. And in the Resilient Cities Index, we've been ranked 6th overall. It's a new index, and we were ranked #1 for environment. We were also the first city to really take the Sustainable Development Goals as important benchmarks and factors for the way that we manage and aspire as a city. And we were the first Australian city to do a voluntary local review and really set the benchmarks for our city and provide ourselves with the opportunity to keep striving for better. Of course, the CLC and the Lee Kuan Yew Prize are central also to the frameworks that we value and ways in which we can create common language, we can create platforms for sharing and learning, and that we can build into our own measurements of success in our city. And for all of those reasons, benchmarking and using rankings are important. Having relativity is also important. I'll come to that in a moment, because sometimes we can also be really hard on ourselves, and understanding where we rank vis-a-vis other cities can be worthwhile. And of course, it also turns us towards those cities where we believe we can learn more because they're doing better than we are. I'm going to go into some of those examples now, but one thing that wasn't in my notes but I really wanted to call out is that we use all these indices as well as a way of marketing and promoting our city. And we don't often talk about that when we're looking at data and research and the hard elements. But I've just been so disappointed by the fact that in the world's best cities 100 rankings that's on your table, and I recommend you read that resonance book, and I know Anupam's going to be speaking a little bit later on the panel, that Sydney's doing better than Melbourne. And it's these sorts of rivalries that really energise and mobilise us. But really the point I wanted to make is that these indices and benchmarks give us the opportunity as well to market ourselves in key sectors that are important for our ongoing prosperity and livability. So let me get into a little bit of detail. Over the past 4 years, and I'm sure you've all been doing the same, we've actually gone back and asked ourselves the base question, do cities even matter anymore? If you, like Melbourne, we were one of the most lockdown cities in the world, and we were told about sea changes and tree changes and that nobody would come back to city workplaces, that what is the role of cities into the future? And we did quite a lot of contemplation and reflection on that question. And of course, it won't surprise you that we decided cities do still matter and will continue to matter into the future, because they are places where we get that agglomeration of talent and investment and opportunity and possibility, where we see all of these elements of innovation, creativity and productivity at scale. And of course, we know that people continue to gravitate to cities. In Australia, we are 87% urbanised. And so the importance of cities has an extra component. But why are they important from our perspective is they'll only remain relevant in people's lives if we focus around what matters to people. And that's really at the heart of liveability. Even though we're central business districts and we're central education and experience districts, and we operate multi-dimension and have a multiplicity of offers, at the heart of all of that, or really at the end of all of those efforts, is what difference can we make in people's lives, and how do we attract more than our fair share of talent from around the world. And so from our perspective, staying focused on the things that matter to people, what they need and what they want, is central to these indices. And that's where we like to focus. Moreover, this is a very dynamic world, the world of benchmarking. There must be thousands. There are certainly probably too many that we utilise to judge our own performance and aspire to new. And I think for all of us, it's an important discussion that we also try to have locally. What are those benchmarks that really matter to our people and the people that we want to attract? Because otherwise, and I've already shown it, we are very competitive in Melbourne and we love indices. We could spend our entire lives chasing benchmarks that really aren't resonating or significant to our local population and the people that we serve. So I think for everybody here, there are important judgment calls to make. Post-pandemic, as I said, in making those reflections, we really wanted to focus on continuing to be a place that wins more than our fair share of talent nationally and globally. And that led us to a new study that Richard Florida has put out, who's a renowned urbanist. And he recently completed a major new study to identify talent magnet cities, a new indices, and one that we are interested in. And he identified that in this contest for talent, for one of the first times in his observations of cities, is that place-related factors were more important than employment-related factors. So factors that we all control, such as cleanliness, safety, housing and amenities, have become more important than pay and career-related opportunities. And this, from our perspective, is exciting and a worthy challenge, and something that we will continue to monitor and manage towards. You'll be delighted to know, and maybe it's the reason I chose to talk about Richard's study today, that Melbourne and Singapore are both in the top 10 of the talent magnet cities. Now, as I said, we're prioritising liveability, and to give that local focus, we've identified 200 data sets that we're measuring locally, literally each and every day. I know CLC in Singapore also have admirable ways in which they are monitoring their own data and evidence to drive progress towards liveability. But I think really identifying those that are important and relevant to you. And even within that framework of prioritising, we're still collecting 200 locally to make our own assessments. It's enormous. And from our perspective, worthwhile, but it takes a huge effort to be able to monitor and then inform our decisions, and then translate that across so many other benchmarking activities. But we do understand that, of course, what gets measured gets managed, and for us, tracking elements that culminate in cities being places for people are the most important. Within the local context, to be able to deliver on our own data sets but keep an eye to international, we have joined with an apolitical local group who do a benchmarking study. They've done it 3 years in a row now, so it's relatively new. And they benchmark us against 20 similar cities around the world, because of course there are an enormous amount of cities. So who do you want to benchmark against is another one of those key decisions for you as city leaders. And so joining with an apolitical, independent organisation to make assessments on those factors important to us has been really useful. And it tells us that, for instance, in the Australian context, Melbourne ranks very highly as being a place for arts, culture and events. It's something we really pride ourselves on. We're the only city in the world that has a Grand Prix and a tennis Grand Slam, for example, but there are more people every weekend that buy a ticket to a live music event than go to a sporting event even. So there's a real mixture there of culture and events. And from our perspective, we will continue to invest in those elements of our city as a key attractor and retainer of people. But that benchmarking study tells us that we have a lot more to do on housing and housing affordability. And that's the other great thing about these benchmarks. It's not just identifying what you're good at. We've also got to be courageous enough as leaders to identify where we have room for improvement. And if anything, it's the extra efforts and investments that go into those areas that you've identified as important for you as cities, and that you've then seen revealed are areas for improvement that really should be a major source of focus for city leaders. It'd be lovely to stay in the positive all the time, but as we know, that's not where we all live. Benchmarking reports ensure that our leaders in Melbourne stay focused on the things that really matter and become very compelling in terms of evidence to support new policies, programs and projects that we need to deliver in Melbourne. I just wanted to touch on the shared language that we can use through benchmarking that helps us with the learning from each other. And thank you so much to the CLC for the World Cities Summit. I don't know about you, I'm right down to the end of a very large page already of ideas that I'm taking back to Melbourne as a result of the interactions and listening at this summit. But without that shared understanding and language, it would be very difficult to translate what we hear into actions that we can take in our city. And my last comment was to come back to the Sustainable Development Goals. For all of us, equity absolutely has to be at the centre of how we build flourishing cities into the future. When I said we want to be a city for people, it's for all people. And how do we harness the things that are working well in our city to make sure that everyone has access to those resources and opportunities? And how do we really put that focus into areas where we need to redress inequality and discrimination? And the Sustainable Development Goals has been the most insightful and important work that we've undertaken in our organisation to bring that equity conversation into our benchmarking work. We are absolutely delighted to be the world record holder of Lee Kuan Yew's Special Mention Prizes. We've got 2 now, but we're also delighted to be here amongst all of you sharing and learning, and I know that's exactly what we'll get with the panel this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Could we request you stay on stage for the photo? May I now invite the rest of our panel speakers and the moderator onto stage with the Lord Mayor before we start the panel. Today's plenary will be moderated by Ms. Ritu Bandari, Manager in Policy Insights at Economist Impact. And our speakers for today are Mr. Anupam Yok, Director of Residence Placemaking, Mr. Andy Hodgson, Global Advisory Services Leader at Arup, Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Dean of the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth's Culture Academy, and Mr. Sumana Rajarethnam, Southeast Asia Director of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network. right, thank you. All right, I will hand it over to Ms. Bandari to moderate the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And a very warm welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this very, very exciting panel on future of livability, redefining urban indices. My name is Ritu Bhandari. I'm a manager in the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact, which is the policy consulting unit of the Economist Group. And it's a pleasure to be moderating this very exciting session with an excellent set of panelists today. And just to set the context and what we heard from the Lord Mayor as well, livability continues to be really important for cities. It's a concept that's getting evolved, that's being redefined as attention to livability shifts from more traditional metrics like the GDP, and next generation of livability practitioners increasingly look at livability as a metric that places the needs of individuals at the center of development. In today's panel, we've brought together perspectives from leading index houses and urban experts to talk about how this concept is changing and how indices are incorporating this new definition of livability. What are some of the challenges, especially around data collection and ensuring consistency of data, and what are some of the best practices? With that, I will jump straight into the discussion. We have a lot of areas to cover today. And what I want to really do as we start this conversation is to come to each one of you to set the context. I also know some of you have slides that you want to share, so that'll be great to have some visuals behind us. But yeah, Anupam, if I could start with you, and the question I want to pose to all of you right at the start is, do urban indices today reflect the distinct characteristics that contribute to a city's livability, and is there a greater role for more qualitative aspects that can play in shaping our understanding of urban livability? So Anupam, perhaps if we could start with you, and then Andy will come to you next.
Thank you. Thank you, Ritu, and thank you for being such a thorough moderator. So appreciate all the homework you made us do, because it's a very important topic. And thank you all for being here. It's a packed room, so that's delightful to know that so many people are interested in this topic. So I think the short answer is yes, they do. And I just wanted to share that I apologize that not all of you have this. This is actually from our archive, so I only had a few copies, but if you do have a copy, please flip to the center of it. There's a reason why I got this particular copy of our ranking. You can see here why. This is, for those of you familiar with Joule, we have no commercial relationship with Joule, but this was really because that particular year, this was published before the pandemic, we had published our rankings, which at that point in time had this idea of a place score, which is measured in 3 buckets really now: livability, lovability, and what I like to call levelability, which is prosperity. How do you make a place more equal? But ultimately indices, we do use a lot of qualitative factors. So we consider how people actually engage with place. What are they saying about place? What are the stories that are being produced on digital channels like Facebook, TripAdvisor, what have you, Google, etc. But ultimately, I do want to say, even though we publish this, we do it because we love working with cities and places, and it's our way of contributing to the global discourse. We think it's a very important tool to really evaluate yourself, perhaps not be too harsh when you're self-judging. I really appreciated the Lord Mayor's comments, because it's a mature outlook on how you actually handle the kind of spotlight that certainly cities like Melbourne have had. You'd be pleased to know that in the most recent rankings, I was looking up, you're now number 31 and Sydney's 35. But we have been dynamically evolving our rankings. And I won't really take you through many of the slides. I wanted to take you through something that I think is pertinent. So this was 2019, and if you look at, this is what cities really care about: talent, visitors, and business. And business and talent are 2 separate things, because companies often look at different factors than talent. So this is what happened post-2020. What's driving people to places now is literally this: broadband access, because people can work from anywhere; hotels, because people are working in very different formats; and venture capital. Now again, we believe this is going to change a great deal over the next couple of years. We are seeing structural changes in real estate, in businesses, fundamentally redefining how they organize themselves internally. Now we're seeing some of this for the first time ever in decades. So I think the place-led factors, which the Lord Mayor talked about, are definitely going to play a much, much bigger role moving forward. These are just some of the current benchmarks we used. I'd also encourage you to get onto the website worldsbestcities.com. We give a very comprehensive view of how we measure what we measure. And we certainly don't consider this, again, some gold standard. I'm a big fan of the Economist and Arup, so I'm delighted we're here on the same stage with them. You can see some of the things we care about, things like walk score and bike score, which we have started to include in our rankings. You know, a competitive city is also a lovable city, and I think that goes without saying. I think practicing love for place is something we feel is reflected through some of what you see on the screen here. So culture, I think, is a very important driver. Funnily enough, more often than not, people trade off culture for even things like safety. You'd be surprised how many people choose to live over places that are considered unsafe, but just go there for the culture. So ultimately, prosperity is a big factor too. So this is it. This is how we do it, and would love your feedback and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Anupam. Really interesting insights there, and I want to dig a little bit deeper later into the data, how you measure some of these as well, because a lot of these are qualitative indicators. We can come back to that, but Andy, on to you next.
Thank you very much, Ritu. And good afternoon, everyone. Great to see a packed house. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, this one. So I'm Andy Hodgson. I'm from Arup. We're a large multidisciplinary organization in the built environment. So our expertise comes from the planning, the strategy development, and then the delivery of infrastructure and cities at their core. And I guess from that perspective, we were looking around and seeing, like we've heard already today, that there's a lot of changes that are happening in the world. And if we reverse back, say, maybe a couple of decades or so, the discussion around cities was predominantly around the economic output, the growth, the changes from that aspect. We saw, well, there's a lot of other challenges we've heard already around changing perceptions, changing desires, let's say, of people who live and frequent cities. And one area that we saw that was driving a lot of the decisions that are happening in cities is the response to climate change, response to the impacts that are happening from a physical nature through to the potential stresses and strains that may happen to that city. So from that perspective, we thought it was good to add our voice to the discussion and start looking at a city from that aspect, bring it in a broader set, a more holistic set of areas to research. And from that perspective, we've looked at about 60 or so cities, I think 63 cities, importantly from the global north and the global south, and looked at how are cities performing across a range of 4 key aspects. So those aspects, one of them is obviously livability, hence the discussion today, but also the governance of a city, looking at the attractiveness from an investor perspective, and also looking at areas around the assets of the city. So they could be physical assets, but they could also be the human capital that resides and is attracted into the city itself. So there's about 30 or so indicators that we focus on. And interestingly, we bring the practitioner viewpoint to those. So as well as taking data from available data sets and other indices that we reference, we also bring our planning and our strategy and our design expertise from those cities and locations to help interpret what does this actually mean? What does good really look like? And what are the emerging areas that cities are focusing on? So if we think about livability, there's obviously a move towards lovability, and I think that's been raised already, and that's bringing in a range of qualitative aspects. Now, qualitative aspects are quite hard from an index point of view because you get a range of taste variation. What some people may love, other people may hate, and you end up with ambivalence in the middle. Excuse me. So how do you consistently assess that? So what we've done in our index is really bringing that practitioner view to assess what does it mean from a city's professional, and then how can we then benchmark and clearly look at those from a range of aspects. So that's what we're doing as Arup. I only have one slide, and that slide is a little bit of a push, really, if you don't mind me. We do have a booth upstairs on the 4th floor, you can see with the red dot, where we have the cities on display. an index on display. So please come and meet many of our team who are there, who can help go through the index, help to interpret what it's saying, and help bring some insight to some of the planning questions that we'll talk about shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks for bringing up the point on climate change. I mean, in our work, we see that that's something that needs to be included in any topic, right? Whether it's livability, resilience, it's a very, very important topic. Thanks for bringing that up. Rosa, if I can come to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not an index house, but I hope to be in the sector that provides inputs to new ways of looking at livability, so that's where I sit. So I just take a step back. I think in 2023, WCS, I've been following WCS conversations for quite some years now. And in 2023, on this frame that you see, it just captures the report from the forum that really affirms that the soul of the city does derive also from culture and heritage, and that was very affirming. The other frame that you see is also from last year, and this is the Singapore Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. And it was called, When is Enough Enough? The Performance of Measurement. And it came back to Singapore, and it was presented at the Singapore Archifest. And to date, I am informed that more than 100,000 respondents in Venice, which is international, and locally in Singapore, they have affirmed that actually cities resonate with them if they have the same things that was observed at the Mayor's Forum last year, and that is identity, memory, culture, history. All of this is important in how they view a city to evolve in a way that matters to them. So building on these insights, of course, this session is important, and I think it's very heartening to know that we are past the why should we do this to how should we do it. So I see real progress in the conversations, and thank you for the indices that are now progressing, and I'm very happy to see the new livability framework, because this is where it matters. If you're going to measure quality of life, creativity, innovation, this is where you can harness the power of the arts and culture, because it is also through arts and culture that you make it very accessible to people from all walks of life to contribute citizen data, feedback, participation, and through a sense of social inclusion, for them to have a stake and ownership over how they can make their cities livable. In the interest of time, and we can explore that further, let me just share some of the things that we are doing in Singapore. So we are very small, as you all know, 700 square kilometers. We haven't stopped trying. We are the UNESCO City of Design. We have one heritage site, many trails. We have more than 70 gazetted monuments and more than 7,000 conserved buildings. Now, these are quantitative measures, but they do show how we try to preserve cultural heritage. Also, participation and engagement are certainly ways in which we can put numbers to what is qualitative and emotionally connective with people, because it is through this that you can actually see activity measured in how they would make their communities and their places vibrant and meaningful to the lived experience, the organic lived experience of people from all walks of life. My last slide. Another way in which my ministry, I come from Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and it is wonderful to be in this ministry because we are measuring in so many ways how Singapore is not just another global city, but it is also a city-state. It is a country to more than 5 million people who come here as newcomers, but are also local born. So we do measure the sense of belonging, and we know that culture does contribute to how you can engage with your people and make them feel that this is a home and not just another transient city. We can explore many of these. This is just some examples of how we can actually put measurement to what is otherwise qualitative. I'll stop there, and we can have conversations later. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa, also for sharing some of those numbers that give a good overview of how we can measure some of these qualitative aspects. Sumana, we've heard about the Livability Index a few times today, so on to you next.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with that statement, which is the Livability Index is dead. And I come to you as someone at the EIU who has built many of these with my colleague Ritu, and so, come to it with a very big skepticism and maybe just a bit of tiredness as well. But why would I say that? Let's examine what the index does, which essentially in its best form takes something that's a very complex idea and distills it into something that's very simple and allows us to tell a story around that. So that's the best form of it. We've seen a proliferation of indices, right? So there's many, many indices that try to capture the same thing at the national level, at the city level, at the neighborhood level. And in my experience, many of these use very similar data sets. And we'll talk about data as well. That's a big issue when it comes to building indices. Instead of seeing more diverse data points, we actually see a centralization of data points, right? So many of these indices use similar or the same data. And so what are the criticisms? My biggest criticism of an index like this is that it tracks very closely to GDP. And so you can take the EIU index, in fact, many of our EIU indices, you can take resonance, you can take the Arup one, and essentially you'll have a very strong correlation to GDP. Richer cities or richer countries are on top. Livability, Damascus is always at the bottom for the EIU index, right? So that's the big criticism, and related to that is the notion of causality, right? So because it's quite a shallow snapshot of data, it gives you the correlation, but it's very difficult to pick apart what is actually driving some of these things when we define them as livability or lovability or livability, however we want to define them. It's difficult to find that causality. And then, who is it for, right? When we design some of our livability indexes, we are looking at MNCs who are moving people around the world. It's helpful for talent relocation, for example. But is it for someone in the city? It's certainly used for people in the city, or people in the city use it, but it's not always designed that way. And that's another thing to keep in mind as we go through this. But, of course, I'm going to sell out and say long live the livability index, right? So not that controversial after all. So why do we use it? We love the narratives, right? We love putting things into a ranking and being able to see who's first and who's second and why they are so. It's very useful for policymakers as well to look at different case studies, to pick apart different policies and see how they are scored. And those case studies actually add a lot of color as well. And where do I think we should move, right? So some of the things that we can discuss later. Actually, yesterday, our Deputy Prime Minister in Singapore, Heng Swee Keat, announced a study that combines geolocation with mental well-being. And I thought that that is extremely interesting because it combines some of the quantitative data with a very, very qualitative aspect. I think geolocation and the data that we have at cities, complicated as it is something that we really need to push the index. I think we need to design indices with different people in mind, different demographics, the older population, youthful population, children who are going to school, I think people who are coming to the city for business, those things we can do, and we can do quite easily. And I really, really think, given the state of the world today and our bout of inflation and high interest rates, we should refocus on something that Anupam mentioned, which is inequality. We should really look at inequality in cities and how it affects our lived environments and our lived experience. And I think there's a unique opportunity to do that in combination with geolocation. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Ritu.
Thank you, Sumana. Really interesting points, thought-provoking points. We'll come back to a lot of them. What I'm hearing from all of you here is really rising importance of those qualitative aspects, right? You talked about mental well-being. Rosa talked about culture. Both of you talked about lovability, which I'm keen to hear more about. How do you define it? How do you measure it? But if we can take a step back, and Andy, if I could start with you this time around what are the emerging aspects of livability that are most relevant today? And we've heard a little bit of that in all of your responses, but what are those aspects and how are these being tracked and measured in indices, including your index?
Great, thanks, Ritu. And just actually a point that Sumana raised before, which we completely agree with and we grappled with as well, which is, trying to stay away from having an index basically replicate what's happening in terms of the wealth of a city or the growth of the city. We recognize that as well. What we've tried to do in our index is really come up with a range of archetypes and say a city is around this archetype because it's portraying these types of aspects, these types of values, and then enable that to be more of a knowledge sharing approach rather than trying to say this is the best and this is the worst. So we've moved away a little bit. We completely agree with you. Just in terms of livability side, yeah, and I touched on the fact that livability is sort of turning into lovability and that magnetism of a city, and that's a word that we're hearing more and more. And how do you measure that? How do you capture that? And it's incredibly hard. But before we go into that, because that's quite a data question, and we'll probably come on to data later, we're also seeing the livability side around the attractiveness of talent. So how do cities attract and retain talent? And we see more and more today about digital nomads, people who can really work anywhere in the world, who are attracted to those broader values that a city or a location possesses. That's super interesting because, when you sort of think about that, people's decision sets are changing. So previously they might be looking at a city from, well, the workplace, how close can I live to that? How efficient would it be for me to get there in the morning? Do I have a school close to me? And X, Y, and Z. We're also now seeing that there's components around wellness and well-being. What does it mean in your overall life choices? And that's another set of data sets that we are looking to collect. Now, we've created, technically we've created a bunch of proxies for that. So we've looked at the vibrancy of a city, we looked at the mixed uses that it portrays to try and capture that. But again, it's more of a data question. How can we really get that? We'll come into the nuts and bolts of that soon. The other side to it that we've seen is a bit of a juxtaposition that's come out in our research. So if you start looking at if we take, say, efficiency as an area, so how efficient is a city, you can measure that. You can measure how connected places are, journey times, congestions, that type of thing. What we've also seen is actually a brand coming through, the value of a brand. So when we've measured cities, we've seen that a city that works incredibly well from that mathematical perspective not be perceived as strong as some of the more historical cities that are seen as better connected. So we've been looking at some of that brand aspects as well. So how can cities use that as a lever to really portray where they are seen around the world? So it's a little bit more than just the mathematical aspects.
Thank you, Andy. Samana, if I could come to you next. Again, do you agree? Do you want to add anything else to that? What are some of the key aspects of livability that you are seeing today, in the livability index, and are some aspects easier to measure than others, and how do you really overcome that challenge?
Yeah, so the qualitative aspects are always more difficult, right? And you have to find ways of how to standardize those. And the way that we do it at the EIU is we build what we call synthetic indicators, which means that instead of relying completely on an analyst rating, so, judge the culture of a city from 1 to 5. We break it down into as many binary questions as possible, and then push that out, right? So it is qualitative, but it becomes a bit less subjective and more comparable, which is what you want for an index. So that's from the sort of methodology point of view. It doesn't get away from the question of how do you measure something like culture. Most indices will measure access, so do you have many museums, how many sporting events do you have, but they don't necessarily tell you how much people appreciate those or whether they want those. So as I mentioned, I think at the end of my comments before, I think geolocation combined with some of these factors could be a big turning point. These are very expensive to measure, of course. We've done it working in various cities in Asia, working with the retailer, right? So we use geolocation data overlapped on social media data to basically tell this retailer where to put their stores. Where do you put a store that's more, say, focused on women or focused on children, based on social media data and what people are reading or where they are going, how long their journeys are taking. why can't we use that type of thinking, which is very useful from a commercial perspective, to think about some of these things like lovability or livability, right? I think inequality is another one that we can use geolocation data. Generally, in cities, in areas that are more low-income neighborhoods, mobility is constrained. You tend to live around that area and not venture far. And so I think putting more of that geolocation and capturing that more effectively and consistently across the city could be another big way of improving measurement.
Thank you, Sumana. Very interesting. Rosa, Sumana touched on the aspect of culture. We've heard from all of you that's increasingly important but harder to measure. How do you measure culture in indices or benchmarks, especially when culture is so different, right, and so unique in every city? I know you'd shared some data points in your slide, which is really interesting, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I believe that some of the metrics that I shared, I think it's not so difficult because I think if you look carefully at cities, they can give you that data. Sometimes what happens is that we are not making the data available. I think if you look at geospatial data, the question is whether we actually had holistically put in that kind of data. And it could be that we never thought that way in the culture sector. But if we took the time to put in things like heritage corners, heritage trails, community public art spaces, and we only very recently in the last few years put in things like hawker centers, because we realized that hawker centers in Singapore is exactly where there's life, there's civic life. So actually there is data. It is a question, I think, and we can explore that later in the subsequent conversation. It is a question of what is the definition we are looking for and how can we make it consistent. But if you delve one step deeper, you can make it consistent because in cities, we have the same sort of, I suppose, civic life and community life. I think the arts as well has got already benchmarks and definitions in many developed arts councils in the world. We also have international standards. So it is a question of actually putting that information into the right areas such that we are in the discourse around livability. I would also say that as you move from livability into issues around lovability and attracting talent, etc., I think you are looking at aspects which are much deeper than the traditional ways in which you look pegged to economic growth. So I would put it that way.
Thank you, Rosa. Anupam, we are hearing a lot about lovability, so maybe I'll ask you to also define it first. I know you talked about it in your slide, but how do you really define it for a city? And also, again, from what I'm hearing, we are really, urban livability is really being reimagined to move away from more economic indicators, or alongside economic indicators, we need to focus more and more on well-being and social sense of belonging that people have in a city. How do you measure these aspects which seem very qualitative? If I could ask you that, and how do you really define lovability?
Sure, thank you. So the way we do it at Resonance, and I'll share a couple of different anecdotes as well to supplement that. But we have looked quite consistently at how people really view their experience. So visitors and locals, and what are people saying through TripAdvisor reviews for places. So for example, we look at culture, number of quality performing arts and cultural experiences recommended by locals and visitors, so on and so forth. So there's about 10 of these categories we look at, and we do change this from time to time. We look at nightlife, restaurants, shopping, attractions, Facebook check-ins, Google search, TripAdvisor reviews overall, Instagram hashtags, and Google Trends. Now again, this is something quite dynamic, and we don't get over-attached too much to our own ideas, so we try and keep it as dynamic as possible. But I think ultimately, it's important to keep an open mind about the idea of lovability, because there can almost be an unhealthy attachment to love as well, so we want to keep it healthy. And what I mean by that is I'll go back to 2019 when I was curating there's a community called the Global Cultural Districts Network, GCDN, some of you may know it. It's a loose federation of 65 or so cultural districts around the world. And I had invited the CEO of the Public Housing Development Board to come and keynote the GCDN, and there were 125 cultural leaders from all over the world. Why did I do that? Because I think it was really important to see where culture is getting produced, not just consumed. So I would argue that in Singapore, while we have some amazing physical places where you can go and consume culture, like the National Gallery or the Singapore Art Museum, etc., there are also places where it's getting produced. You go to the void decks. When I have visitors in Singapore, I take them to, the HDB hub. 90% of Singapore lives in public housing. That's where culture is getting produced. So to me, it's very important to supplement the indices that we produce by looking at ways that you can engage with place that you can't capture. I think we have to sort of look at limits to measurement as well.
Really, really good points. Thank you, Anupam. We've been talking a lot about what livability means and how do you measure that. I also want to talk about what you were saying, some of the challenges. And as we know, and we've been discussing this again, that cities are very different. Every city is unique, whether it's income, whether it's their geography, whether it's culture. So perhaps, Rosa, if I can start with you this time, considering all this, distinctive characteristics that cities have, is there a common definition of livability that they can aspire to? And is it even, is it fair to measure these different cities?
I think I'll put to you that it has never stopped us in our tracks to put out and measure economic activity or, other types of dimensions. And cities are all different. It's not about context. Every city is different. Every country is different. I would just begin first by saying that there must be, I guess you might call it political will or commitment to measure some of this. And it's really where the rubber hits the road. You've got to make investments in capturing data and getting your research done properly. And as importantly, we need to harness, today we've got great opportunities with technology. Are we actually building the technology platforms such that data can be put in there, analyzed, and shared as well? There's another dimension, share the data. And I like the idea, and this is within cities. Then what you need to do, of course, is also to invest across countries to international platforms which can do the sort of thing that Maya spoke about, which is benchmarking and learning from other cities. So I don't think it's a question of being stopped on tracks because we are all very different. That's never stopped us in other domains. I think it is a question of saying that if you actually believe that livability and lovability is beyond the physical, but you have to measure the emotive metrics, then some like-minded countries can begin first, or cities can begin first, make the investment into the research and the analytics, and then build the technology platforms for that to happen.
Thank you. Sumana, your thoughts on this? We cover a lot of cities in our indices, and this is a challenge, ongoing challenge, right? They are very different. Rosa talked about how we can still define, some of those qualitative aspects for cities and measure them. What are your thoughts? Is it fair to compare cities that are so different from each other?
It's the trade-off, right, in an index that you make things comparable, and so you lose some of the contextualization that you have in each city. But that's the definition of an index, right? So I think that if you're using an index as a tool, then you just have to kind of know that that's a trade-off that you will make. What I would say though is that we are seeing a few more interesting ways of doing things. I think you, Ritu, worked on something with UN Habitat, where we use the SDGs and UN Habitat's framework to build the index. So essentially the indicators were there, but then also we didn't rank the cities, right? So we collected all of the data. We did it in a few pilot cities, including sort of cities that were very different from each other, like Dhaka and Toronto. But instead of putting them in a table, while we did all of that scoring, we just never did the rank, right? So you could see all the scores and you could make some of the differentiations. But then what we did was really deep dive into each city to say, okay, what is giving you this characteristic, right? What are the great case studies in your city that's driving up, say, trust in the city? What's happening there? And so that gives you the context, but of course you remove the comparability.
Thank you for bringing up that model. Andy and Anupam, if I can quickly hear your thoughts on this as well, and then we'll move to Q&A. But
Sure, I'm conscious of time. I think from our perspective, it's what is an index used for, and it's not losing sight of that. I think from our perspective, an index is a starting point of deeper research. It's having that starting point to say, relatively, this city is doing well here or might learn from others in this aspect. And it's all about the so what. So not necessarily about the index, but what can we do from the learnings from the other competitors, let's say, on that aspect. Maybe I stop at that point because of time.
Sure, so I'll add to that. It is a starting point. It can be used for busting myths as well. So for example, I'm just going to read something out quickly. While factors such as time to commute to work, crime, or housing affordability do indeed shape our perception of cities when it comes to choosing a location to live within a city, our analysis, this is the Best Cities research, shows that these factors have little to no relationship with the performance of an urban area overall when it comes to attracting talent, tourism, and investment. That was really interesting for us because the general perception is actually that the opposite of that. So I think this is, again, a learning point. It's a reference. I think the general idea, I was talking to a friend in the audience earlier, and they were saying it's human to compare. You heard the Lord Mayor talk about. So I think bringing out the positive competitiveness of places, but ultimately recognizing that this is, in my view, a cooperative network, really.
Thank you for that. Okay, yeah, we do have some more time before Q&A. Sorry, my bad. I think this is a good point to really talk about data. All of you have touched upon the challenges with data. Sumana, you talked about a lot of geolocation data that is being used now. Anupam, you talked about social media and data from Instagram, TripAdvisor ratings. Again, Andy, if I could perhaps start with you, how can data sharing be effectively utilized to enhance the use of indices and improve future livability? What are some best practices and challenges there?
Sure, absolutely. Maybe a step back a little bit first. So data just underpins the entire index, if we're honest about it. And that's what's helped us really choose the certain cities that we've chosen. Because those cities, we could develop a consistent data set that's captured in the same way, that's assessed in the same way, for the same time, for the same currency, and so on. Because what we find is that cities are collecting data at different intervals, different methodologies, different interpretations, different summaries. Sometimes you also have to look at country-based statistics to develop something for a city. So that's why we've seen that data has underpinned everything, because we wanted it to be internally consistent, so it's fair and representative. What does it mean in terms of collecting data, though? I think one thing that we are super aware of is that collecting data is expensive. It's timely, it's just another thing to do and another thing to get your head around. So some of the more modern ways, we should call it, of collecting data through either crowdsourcing or getting semantic data from the internet and others is a super interesting way of looking at things. What we've got to be careful, though, is the quality of that data, that it's not being placed down a certain direction. So that's a hard thing to look at, but it's something that I know others, particularly on this panel, are looking at the moment. In terms of sharing of information, we see that as being fundamental to the way forward, because really it's that openness of engagement and learning. What we're seeing, that whilst we're calling it cities' competitiveness, we're also seeing cities collaborate with each other to solve some of the more tricky pictures and tricky issues out there, particularly within a single country. So that sharing information and creating an overall positioning of the city within the ecosystem is a super interesting way that we're seeing countries move forward.
Thank you.
Well, just to build on what I was saying earlier, one of the best uses of the data is to also look at your peers, who you might be similar to and learn from. There could be aspirational ideas that you get from this data. By the way, data fundamentally is not just numbers, right? So how I feel is a data point. And I think the ability to gather this data, and when we talk about well-being in particular, we obviously look at the external landscape through a lot of these metrics. But I think the North Star is really to get to a point where we can really figure out the internal landscape of, for example, what this room is feeling like. And I think technology and understanding of how to get stuff in real time so that it's made available quickly is something that we feel we are getting to, because there are an amazing number of platforms out there who are all creating, whether it's new companies or organizations, and sharing data. So I think the value of data is important. We shouldn't make it central, but I think it's important to keep looking and pushing what are we really measuring. And ultimately, in my mind, economics is subordinate to the ecology of experience. It's important, but we must really study the well-being of place, which is the well-being of our people. So that's truly the most important thing, and the connection between place and people. Can we measure, for example, how I'm feeling, not just at over time, but at a particular point in time?
Are there ways that we can do that?
Yeah, there are agencies who gather this data. So I think the more open we get in sharing our data, making it comparable, there are companies like ours that will consume that data and interpret it and produce it back. So I think ultimately, as I said, it is about cooperative networks, cooperative data warehouses, right? It can be anonymized. I think we're getting there.
Are there some risks to this as well, right, with privacy? Because like the kind of data you're saying, if we start collecting that kind of data, there needs to be...
We are not collecting the data. People are sharing that data. There's a big difference. I don't think there is a proactive effort to collect data which people don't want to share. But if you see where the world is going, citizens are demanding certain types of services. Citizens are demanding certain types of qualities from the places they inhabit. And we must listen to our people. So to me, I think it's very important to be clear, this is not about top down, bottom. This is not generic. This is really trying to listen to people and what they want. And I think people inherently living in communities are open to sharing. So we should listen to what they're sharing.
I'd like to make 2 quick points. One is that I think in the Singapore experience anyway, there's no need to really invest a lot in getting fresh and new data. We have a lot of data. It is a question of what matters when you want to construct your view of livability and lovability. And then it is a question of having that kind of a system and process to mine that data and put it together. So that's the first point. I think we have a lot of data in Singapore. It's what are we looking at? The second thing I want to say is that we should also talk about the subjectivity in indices, because it's how you weight things, right? So it's the weighting that finally adds up to how you rank cities and so on. And that is where, no matter how much of numbers you have, right, we still need to have conversations around judgment. And this is about how we also have moved on in the new Liveability Index. This kind of conversation helps, because no amount of numbers is going to help you with that kind of judgment that is, I think, only comes across through conversations and insights that we share across cities. So it comes down to sharing insights as much as you share data.
Thank you. Sumana, your thoughts?
Yeah, just to pick up on a point that Rosa just mentioned, in most of our EIU indices, we have a feature where you can change your weights, right? So you choose as an individual consumer what you think is important. You know, to pick up on the archetypes, there are city archetypes, but there are also archetypes of people that live in the city, right? And I think that that's an easy way of actually using existing data, matching those archetypes in some theoretical way to how you would weight the index, right? So you would say that perhaps a certain archetype would weight different features, say safety or education or cost of living, differently from other archetypes, right? So that's one thing that we could do. Data privacy is essential. I talked about geolocation, and I gave that example of the retailer. We are able to do that in certain cities because the data is available by law, and we can use it. Another agency collects it. But in other cities in the same country, we're not able to do that, right? And then if you're going to make an index, then you can't compare those cities. So you have to find ways around that. And then I think, you know, really kind of also reimagining certain things, right? I read about this thing called the ice cream index. Essentially, you know, we talk about safety. We usually measure it in indices using, you know, number of accidents or number of robberies or things like that. But I can't remember who it was, but they came up with this idea of how easy is it for a child to go and get an ice cream from home? How long does it take? You know, will he come back or will they come back? If a grandparent wants to go with them, is it too far? You know, those types of things, which I think, you know, it's useful to try and collect some of that data. You won't be able to do it across many cities and across, you know, all of the different types of indicators like that, but those kind of things give you a much better sense.
Thank you. Really, really interesting examples. I
had one anecdote to share of something we dropped from the data set, which was weather. Just getting weather information. We got constant feedback about why you know, how do you qualitatively, if a city is too hot, it still may be perfectly fine, like where we are. So we have replaced it with, for example, walk score and bike score, but that wasn't available 10 years ago. So I think the limited point is that we've got to be listening to our constituents ultimately, and which is both cities and the people who inhabit them.
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, we face this all the time, right? And what we do is we make these background indicators because a lot of cities, right, like you're saying that Singapore might be very hot, but you might be able to walk here more than a city which is not as hot.
It's noise, so you've got to remove the noise from the background, yes.
Exactly. Thank you for bringing that up, Anupam. I want to talk next about use of these indices. We've been saying, policymakers use it a lot, businesses use it a lot. What should determine when they use it and versus not? And Andy, if I could start with you this time, what opportunities and key considerations should be involved really in using these indices for urban policy and decision making?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because we do speak to quite a lot of policymakers around the world and who are looking at data sets and objectively around where does their city position and how they can learn from that. I think the one thing that we normally say is just take it as one data point. Don't create policy on the back of what you see from a couple of indices. It's interesting to show themes and trends that you could dive deeper into, and this is all about the so what of these indices, what does this actually mean, but clearly it's not making specific policy decisions on the back of them. I think what's also interesting to really get under the skin of is what is the need of that index and what is it trying to achieve? Because many indices around the world are not there to maybe frame an area that you're going to use it to drive a decision on. So it's being very careful from it. In terms of what we suggest, I think when we look at these indices, and we're a consumer of many indices as well, when we're giving advice around the world, we're looking at how does an area rank and how does an area compare with some of its competitors in its own ecosystem. We use that as a way of cutting through from the universe of things to look at to 4 or 5 key areas. So what couple of areas look to be outstanding and where can you then double down on what it's doing? Or what are the couple of areas where it seems to be trailing behind some of its competitors out there? What can you learn and what can you bring through? And that's generally our suggestion to city planners and policymakers. Look at it in that view.
Thank you. Anupam, if I can come to you next, and after that I'll pause for Q&A and then we can continue on this question. But I remember when we were chatting earlier, you said that these indices should be taken with a pinch of salt. And how should policymakers or businesses determine when should use these versus not?
So I wouldn't. I wouldn't need. I'm not a policymaker, nor am I a business owner who would consume this data. So I would say I would leave it to the users to determine how they interpret and use this. We make it openly available. It's not commercially linked to our business. We like it because we love the sector and we love working with cities and places. I think the way I look at it is how we can directly engage with people. So our website it's a nice name, World's Best Cities. It's really visited. And I think we love the fact that we can engage. During the pandemic, we started a festival for urban innovation called World City, ironically very closely sounding to World City Summit, but World City, as Limin said, that it's badly spelled, WRLDCTY. So in any case, to me, it's really working directly with people. So we love working with university students, with really people who are trying to get a deeper understanding of context and place and not looking at this as necessarily a competitive set. Obviously, there is some factors of comparison here. But I think the best utilization is enhancing your skill of observation. I think first observe, grasp. This is a massive data set that I think people can use in all sorts of creative ways. So I would say that you have a lovely audience here. Maybe you can ask them.
Thank you. And I think the point on weights that you were mentioning, Rosa and Sumana earlier, right? Like it's also using those weights in these indices to see what's best suited for your city and applying them in really using these indices. I'll come to Sumana and Rosa for your thoughts on this question as well. But before that, I just want to ask the audience to submit any questions that you might have using the QR code on the screen. So please do scan the QR code and send any questions. I'll get them here and I'll make sure to pose it to the panelists. As the audience does that, Sumana, if I could come to you with the same question around use of these indices, whether policymakers or other stakeholders who are using it.
Yep, I think policymakers generally use it for a few reasons. One is marketing, right? So you use it, especially if you perform well or if you've improved a lot to get that message out there, and it's useful to have various companies or consultancies that publish this type of information, so you're not doing it yourself. The other one is targeting and KPIs, right? So they set goals. Sometimes they make them public. A lot of the time they are internal, but they track these indices over time to see how they are performing internally. I think that's a big use. And then also to identify areas of weaknesses by comparing against other cities, right? I really think that the best indices that we have done at the EIU are ones where we have the time in the project to involve the cities in the data collection. Because as you said, you know, cities produce data at different times. They're really not as consistent as at the national level. And so if you have longer time and you are able to collect data and you send the data request to each of the cities, you know, through their mayors or through their stats departments, you usually get a much more robust index. And even if you can't compare all the data, you can at least use it in some way. And then companies use it, and I'll just say this one anecdote, which is that, you know, the Liveability Index is one of our most famous indices, and we've had it for a long time, so that longevity gives it some power. But also, right at the end of the report, there is a recommendation for how much you should increase the pay package of someone you're relocating based on their livability score, right? So, you know, if you have a certain score that's in the top branch, you really don't need to increase any pay. But if you're sending someone basically to one of the really poor performing cities, then yes, you have to give them a big pay bump, right? So companies use it in that way, right? So they use many indices and they compare them to make these types of decisions.
Thank you. That goes back to the point that Andy made earlier about attractiveness of talent, right? So that touches upon that. Rosa, your thoughts on this, and then I have some questions already. I'll move on
so very quickly, I think that I would echo what Lord Mayor said just now, which is that I think the most useful for policymakers is to have the courage and confidence to look at how what you can be educated on in terms of your ranking. Sure, if you do well, sure, you know, it is for branding and marketing, but if you didn't do so well, then the question is, look at how you could do better, because you look at other good, practices, right? So that's one use of for policymakers. I would say that the second use is this. It's very instructive when you look at how livability indices are constructed, because when you look at those dimensions, you begin to understand the connections across domains. So then you understand, I see, you know, for me to contribute to livability, I've got to work with my folks, my friends, across in healthcare in a certain way, in education and so on. We all come together as a coherent whole for the betterment of citizens' lives if we understand how we are connected across domains, and I think indices can help with that understanding.
Thank you, Rosa. I'll move on to the Q&A because we already have a lot of interesting questions. There's a very specific one, Anupam, for you. How are the walk score and bike score defined and calculated?
So we don't do the bike score and the walk score. It's publicly available. You can visit the walk score, bike score platform. I won't get into it. It's going to take too long.
Okay, sure. And there's a specific question around measuring health indicators, because health is so important to livability. You know, how are indices measuring and incorporating physical and mental health outcomes in different indices? From my experience, I know that physical health indicators are easier to incorporate. There's data on, for example, I remember one of the indices where we include time that an ambulance takes to reach a household. This kind of data is available around health, but want to open it to whoever would like to take that up, specifically focusing on health indicators, if any of your indices include that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is access again, right? So when we look at indicators for health, it tends to be number of hospital beds, you know, number of doctors or nurses, number of specialists, number of hospitals even, right? Like those types of things, and then you track it per capita, so you get some way of measuring it, and then also cost, right? How much do certain treatments cost, and you choose your treatments based on what you're trying to find out in that index. And so there's a limit really to those types of indicators. You know, I think they're useful from an infrastructure standpoint, but not so much when you're capturing other things, right? So mental health, for example, how do you capture something like that? You know, the definition of mental health is very different. If you ask a respondent in Baghdad versus Singapore, you know, completely different. You know, so even the qualitative aspect of asking that, I think is very tricky. But it's something that we really should explore, right? There's the sort of happiness surveys and things like that, and what can you do to draw out that data in a more complex way? And then the other thing I would say is, you know, try to compare some of the perception data, so the survey data, to the hard data that you have, the quantitative data, and see how those map against each other.
Yeah, I want to quickly add to that. One way that we measure or can start measuring mental health, we've done recently in one of our indices, is by looking at it more from policy perspective. So are there, you know, campaigns to make people, residents of cities, aware about mental health, which are very easily accessible, whether on digital platforms or otherwise. So that's one way to start it. So while you can't exactly measure how people are feeling sometimes when you have a lot of cities, you know, you can use these other indicators that are creating that safe environment for people.
So I just wanted to share that we have a sister company called Mixed, and the founder is sitting right there. So Erin, sorry to give you a shout out, but Erin's a meditation teacher, and we've been working together to explore something called the Conscious Cities Index, which really looks at the impact of the built environment on our social health, emotional health, and mental health. And the notion there is, and we haven't got to a point where we can share anything yet, but we have done casual research. We also do advocacy. In fact, you may have something called the Big Sit Festival on your desks, so please have a look at it and share your feedback and get involved. But I think, to me, the big differentiation is we confuse sick care for healthcare. So it's easier to measure sick care in terms of hospitals, et cetera, but we're talking about healthcare. So some of the easy ways that you can do is look at the relative progress of longevity, average age, et cetera. So there are some simpler measures, but I think it's very important to look at things like public spaces, access to parks, and are they performing in terms of their utility? How do they serve as, we know physical health gyms, we call them social health gyms or mental health gyms, which are actually public spaces, and the quality of air quality, et cetera. So I think we are getting there again, but it's very important to differentiate between sick care and healthcare. And I think the best cities are going to be those that really focus on preventative healthcare outcomes.
Thank you, Anupam. Very interesting. There are a couple of questions on a topic that I'm also very passionate about around climate change, and we couldn't get to discuss that, you know, in the time, but it's a good time to bring that in. And again, posing this to any of you, maybe Andy, if we can start with you on this one. How might livability as a concept need to evolve given current rates of climate change? And there's another one: what measures are being taken globally to ensure future cities remain livable amidst the climate change impacts that are going to take place? We are seeing that already, right? There's so many heat waves, so many cities already getting impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. It's becoming, you know, day by day more and more obvious and more in people's decision sets. And I think I highlighted at the beginning that was one of the areas that drove Arup to develop the city's competitive index, because we saw that climate was becoming more and more higher up on people's agendas, that it had to form part of the analysis that people were taking. What we have done is look at climate across all four of the aspects that we cover in the index. So from how it's planning and how it's driving those plans, so that's on the governance of a city, through to how is it performing. So we have an urban heat index, for example, so we can measure that and see how cities are changing over time. And that's now being used by businesses, for example. So businesses that are looking to invest in cities, where can they go? Well, where will they be most exposed? Where are the higher resilience? And it's not just on those cities that could be more physically exposed. What we found is that there is a lot of support behind cities that have an actionable plan in place, that have the governance and leadership to drive it. They are scoring better than cities that may not have the immediate environmental impacts that are pertinent to them. So just having that aspect in place has been really sort of valued, let's say, by those decision makers out there.
Really, really good point. Thanks, Andy. Sumana.
Yeah, and so to add to what Andy said, for climate indicators, for indices, they generally also track very well to GDP, right? And I think that there's an interesting point around what you said. Right now, we focus a lot on some indicators that look at energy security, so how much energy you have and how available it is. But on the other hand, I think we need to look at the shift to energy transition, right? So what happens when a city is actually very focused on sort of decarbonization and meeting sort of net zero goals, right? And that tension, we capture some of it in Indices. You just described some of that. But I think that inflection point is when we will actually start looking at more important climate aspects to citizens that live there, or residents rather.
Thank you. Anupam.
Well, I would just say 2 points. Cities like Singapore have accepted the changes that are likely to happen and are responding in terms of preparedness, building infrastructure. And then there are others, and there were some amazing stories of what happened when a city is confronted with something like an earthquake. So disaster preparedness, that is ultimately the resilience of people, how quickly they respond as a community to a disaster, to me is the ultimate indicator. So I think you will find that cities that work on collective action versus individual action are far better prepared to respond to risk.
Really, really good point. Rosa.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said, but maybe just for an added dimension, I think you should also measure the degree to which citizens are involved in the conversation. So there could be other dimensions around social inclusion and civic participation around resources, and this must touch every part of life. So it's how you engage every citizen from all segments of the society, because when you talk about the future, and especially, I don't think we have enough time, but we need to talk about how you engage the young people. So in my ministry, we pay a lot of attention to youth engagement and the measurements around that, around how is it just very superficial understanding, or are they actually, do they have agency and ownership around issues? Because that will define, I think, whether you have a sustainable future for your city and your people.
Thank you, Rosa, for bringing up that important point on citizen inclusion. And Anupam, really agree with you on that readiness, because again, the Resilient Cities Index that we've recently produced, Japan does really well on training their citizens to respond when a disaster strikes. So although they might have the earthquake risk similar to another cities or countries, but their citizens they know how to respond quickly. So involving them in preparing these plans, but also getting them ready to act in those situations is really important, and thank you for bringing that up. We are at time, and thank you so much, all of you, for all the panelists for joining. Really interesting discussion. We managed to touch a lot of interesting aspects, from importance of lovability, well-being, and I'm really glad we got to talk about climate in the end as well. Thank you to the audience for bringing that up. That's really, really important in this conversation. And thank you, all of you, for your time as well. I'll end this session here and pass it back to you. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you.